a single waterway, 100 miles of sand turned to sea, and the complete destruction of a nation's sovereignty. The Suez Canal generates $9.4 billion annually for Egypt today. That's $26 million every single day. Ships carrying 30% of the world's container traffic pass through this narrow channel. Without it, cargo vessels would add 14 days and thousands of miles sailing around Africa. But here's what nobody talks about. Egypt didn't control its own canal for 87 years. Britain stole an empire with one check. Benjamin Disraeli, Queen Victoria's Prime Minister, bought control of the Suez Canal for £4 million in 1875. That's roughly $500 million today. He did it in secret, without parliamentary approval, using money borrowed from the Rothschild banking family. The transaction took 7 days. Egypt built the canal. Egyptian workers died by the thousands digging it. The Egyptian government went bankrupt financing it. And then Britain simply took it. The man who made it possible was a French diplomat who convinced an Egyptian ruler to mortgage his nation's future. The construction killed between 30,000 and 120,000 workers depending on whose numbers you believe. The canal opened in 1869 as a symbol of progress and international cooperation. 6 years later, Egypt lost everything. What followed was 87 years of foreign control, 2 world wars fought over this waterway, and a crisis in 1956 that nearly triggered World War III. When Egypt finally took back the canal, Britain, France, and Israel invaded. The United States had to intervene to prevent nuclear escalation. This is the Suez Canal. On November 17, 1869, Empress Eugénie of France stood on the deck of the imperial yacht L'Aigle, watching the first convoy of ships enter the Suez Canal. Behind her, 68 vessels from around the world waited their turn. Fireworks exploded over the desert, champagne flowed on every deck. European newspapers called it the greatest engineering achievement since the Roman aqueducts. Egypt's ruler, Khedive Ismail Pasha, had spent the equivalent of $2 billion in today's money hosting the celebration. He commissioned Giuseppe Verdi to compose Aida for the occasion. He built an opera house in Cairo in just 6 months. The festivities lasted 3 weeks. What most people don't know is that Egypt was already bankrupt. The canal had cost 3 times the original estimate. Ismail had borrowed from every European bank willing to lend. French investors held the majority of shares, and Britain, which had initially opposed the canal as a threat to its imperial trade routes, behind the champagne toasts and architectural marvels was a financial trap that would snap shut within 6 years. Egypt in the 1850s was not technically independent. It was an autonomous province of the Ottoman Empire, ruled by a hereditary governor called the Khedive. But Egypt had unusual autonomy, its own army, diplomatic relations, and crucially, the ability to borrow money internationally. The ruling Muhammad Ali dynasty saw the canal as Egypt's path to becoming a truly modern power. Connect the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, transform Egypt into the crossroads of global trade, collect transit fees from every ship traveling between Europe and Asia. The vision was brilliant. The execution was disastrous. Egypt didn't have the engineering expertise to build the canal alone. It didn't have the capital to finance construction, and it didn't have the diplomatic sophistication to navigate European imperial ambitions. But to understand how completely Egypt lost everything, we need to go back to where this story really begins. Not in 1869 when the canal opened, but in 1854 when a French diplomat with unlimited ambition convinced an Egyptian ruler to gamble his nation's future on a ditch through the desert. Ferdinand de Lesseps was 50 years old when he walked into the Cairo palace of Sa'id Pasha in November 1854. He carried no formal engineering credentials. He had no backing from the French government. What he had was a personal friendship with Egypt's new ruler dating back 20 years, and an obsession with a canal that engineers said was impossible. The idea wasn't new. Napoleon Bonaparte had surveyed the isthmus in 1799 and concluded a canal was feasible. Ancient Egyptians had built waterways connecting the Nile to the Red Sea as early as 1850 BCE. The concept had haunted European engineers for decades. What changed in 1854 was political opportunity. Sa'id Pasha had just become Egypt's ruler after his uncle Abbas I was murdered. Sa'id was young, modernization obsessed, and eager to prove himself on the world stage. De Lesseps arrived with detailed plans, glowing testimonials from French engineers, and a financial projection showing the canal would make Egypt fabulously wealthy. He left with a concession contract that would destroy Egypt's future. The Suez Canal Company concession, signed November 30th, 1854, granted de Lesseps extraordinary powers. The company would operate the canal for 99 years after opening. Egypt would provide the land for free. Egypt would supply forced labor for construction. Egypt would receive 15% of annual profits once the canal became profitable. The company controlled by French shareholders would receive the rest. Read that again. Egypt would provide the land, the labor, and the state subsidies. France would own the majority of shares and collect 85% of profits for 99 years. Sa'id signed it without consulting his ministers or the Ottoman Sultan. De Lesseps had pitched it as Egypt's path to greatness. What Sa'id didn't understand was the financial structure buried in the contract. The company could issue shares publicly, raising capital from European investors. Egypt couldn't sell its shares without company approval. The company set transit fees. Egypt had no veto power over operations. De Lesseps immediately went to Paris and began selling shares. French investors, excited by visions of commercial dominance over British trade routes, subscribed enthusiastically. De Lesseps positioned the canal as a French triumph, a monument to engineering prowess that would cement France's position as a global power. Britain was furious. Lord Palmerston, the British Prime Minister, denounced the project as a flagrant fraud upon the Sultan. British engineers published papers claiming the canal was geologically impossible, that sand would fill it constantly, that the sea level difference between the Mediterranean and Red Sea would create catastrophic flooding. The British press called it de Lesseps' folly. What Britain really feared was French control over the route to India. British officials pressured the Ottoman Sultan to revoke Sa'id's concession. The Sultan, already nervous about Egypt's growing autonomy, initially sided with Britain. He sent orders to Cairo forbidding work on the canal. Sa'id ignored them. This created a bizarre situation. Egypt was technically Ottoman territory, but Sa'id had enough independence to defy Constantinople. De Lesseps had French backing but no official French government endorsement. Britain opposed the project but couldn't directly intervene without Ottoman permission. So the digging began anyway, in April 1859, on a small scale at first. De Lesseps staged a ceremonial groundbreaking at Port Said, the Mediterranean terminus named for the Egyptian Khedive. French engineers mapped the route, and then the human cost started mounting. The canal route ran 100 miles through desert, from Port Said on the Mediterranean to Suez on the Red Sea. Engineers estimated they would need to move 97 million cubic yards of sand and stone. In 1859, that meant human labor, thousands of workers with shovels, baskets, and wheelbarrows. Sa'id instituted the corvée system, a form of forced labor that was technically legal under Ottoman law. Every month, Egyptian villages were required to send a quota of men to work on the canal. They received minimal pay, inadequate food, and worked 12-hour days in desert heat that routinely exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The workers weren't technically slaves. They were conscripted laborers whose refusal to work could result in imprisonment or beatings. The distinction didn't matter much when you were standing in sand up to your knees, moving dirt with your bare hands. De Lesseps insisted the work was voluntary. He published pamphlets describing pleasant working conditions and fair wages. French shareholders received glowing reports about construction progress. What they didn't hear about was the death toll. Cholera swept through work camps in 1865, killing thousands. Dysentery was constant. Workers died from heat exhaustion, accidents, and untreated injuries. No one kept accurate records. Egyptian historians later estimated between 30,000 and 120,000 workers died during construction. French company records acknowledged fewer than 3,000 deaths. The truth was probably somewhere between, but the exact number became irrelevant because Britain found a weapon more powerful than Ottoman pressure: international public opinion. In 1863, Napoleon III formally endorsed the canal project, giving de Lesseps the French government backing he'd lacked. Britain couldn't oppose France directly without risking war, so British diplomats shifted tactics. They publicized the corvée system, framing it as slavery. British newspapers ran illustrations of Egyptian workers dying in the desert to build a French company's private project. The campaign worked. International pressure forced Sa'id's successor Ismail Pasha to abolish the corvée system in 1864. The canal company lost its free labor supply. De Lesseps responded by mechanizing. He brought in steam-powered dredgers from Europe, massive machines that could excavate in hours what hundreds of men took days to move. The machines were expensive. Construction costs doubled. De Lesseps demanded compensation from Egypt for losing the forced labor. Ismail, desperate to keep the project moving, agreed. Egypt paid the Suez Canal Company 38 million francs, roughly $80 million in today's money, as compensation for abolishing slavery. You see the pattern forming. Every step forward cost Egypt more money and transferred more control to European interests. The canal was being built on Egyptian soil with Egyptian subsidies, but the economic benefits were flowing to Paris. By 1869, after 10 years of construction, the canal was ready. It ran 100 miles, averaged 300 feet wide, and was deep enough for fully loaded cargo ships. Engineers had moved 97 million cubic yards of material. The final cost exceeded 400 million francs, roughly $2 billion today. Egypt had contributed nearly half that cost through direct payments, land grants, and labor subsidies. Egypt owned 44% of shares, but Egypt didn't control operations, couldn't set fees, and would wait years before seeing any profit. The opening ceremony Ismail hosted in November 1869 was his attempt to declare Egypt's arrival as a modern power. The festivities cost another £2 million. Ismail wanted the world to see Egypt as an equal to European nations, a sovereign state capable of extraordinary engineering achievement. What the world actually saw was a country mortgaged to European creditors, celebrating infrastructure it didn't control, with borrowed money it couldn't repay. But Ismail didn't know that yet. In November 1869, standing beside Empress Eugenie as the first ships entered the canal, he believed Egypt had secured its future. He had 6 years before reality arrived, 6 years before Britain made its move, and 6 years before Egypt discovered that building the canal was easy compared to keeping it. Ahmed Hassan was 19 years old when soldiers arrived at his village in the Nile Delta in 1861. They carried a list of names. His was on it. He was given 2 days to report to a labor camp near Lake Timsah, 60 miles south of Port Said. He never came home. Ahmed's story, documented in a letter his mother sent to regional authorities in 1862, was repeated thousands of times across Egypt during canal construction. Villages throughout the Delta and Upper Egypt were required to supply workers monthly under the corvée system. The quota wasn't voluntary. Local officials who failed to meet their numbers faced punishment. Workers who refused to report faced imprisonment. The system was legal under Ottoman law, used for centuries to build public works like irrigation canals and military fortifications. But the Suez Canal wasn't a public work. It was a private company project, owned predominantly by French shareholders, extracting forced labor from Egyptian citizens. This distinction mattered enormously in international law, though it meant nothing to the men digging. At peak construction between 1861 and 1864, the Suez Canal Company employed 60,000 workers simultaneously. Most were Egyptian corvée laborers. They worked in rotating shifts, typically 3 months at a time before returning home and being replaced by fresh conscripts. The company paid them nominal wages, usually 5 to 10 piastres per day, barely enough for food. Working conditions were medieval in a project marketed as the pinnacle of modern engineering. Workers lived in tent camps along the canal route, with minimal sanitation. Water was scarce. Medical care was nearly non-existent. The work itself involved digging trenches 20 feet deep in loose sand that constantly collapsed. Men stood in lines passing baskets of sand from the excavation to the surface. The fortunate ones had wheelbarrows. Most worked with their hands and primitive tools. French engineers documented the process with clinical detachment. One 1862 report noted that The Arab workers demonstrate satisfactory endurance in desert conditions, requiring minimal oversight to maintain adequate productivity. Translation: they worked until they collapsed, and overseers beat them if they stopped. Disease killed more workers than accidents. Cholera outbreaks in 1865 devastated the camps. The disease thrived in crowded conditions, with contaminated water supplies. Workers became ill, died within hours, and were buried in mass graves in the desert. Company records listed cause of death as fever or simply illness, obscuring the scale of cholera casualties. Heat exhaustion was constant. Summer temperatures in the desert exceeded 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Workers had no shade, inadequate water rations, and no break during the hottest hours. French supervisors, working in covered areas with servants, bringing water and food, noted in reports that local workers were naturally adapted to desert heat. They weren't. They were dying. Mohammed al-Abbasi, an Egyptian engineer who later wrote a history of the canal's construction, interviewed survivors in the 1920s. Their testimonies described working conditions in detail. Men dug in sand that was often contaminated with salt, causing skin lesions and infections. They slept in tents that offered no protection from sandstorms. They ate a daily ration of bread and lentils that provided barely enough calories for the physical labor required. One survivor, whose name al-Abbasi recorded only as Mahmoud from Beni Suef, described being conscripted at age 17 in 1862. He spent 6 months at a camp near Lake Manzala. Of the 200 men who arrived with him, 43 died during those 6 months. Mahmoud survived by working in the camp kitchen, avoiding the hardest labor in the excavation trenches. What's important to understand is that de Lesseps and the Suez Canal Company actively concealed these conditions from European investors and the international press. Company shareholders in Paris and London received quarterly reports describing efficient construction progress, modern equipment, and satisfied workers earning fair wages. The reality in Egypt was forced labor on an industrial scale. Britain, despite opposing the canal politically, found the corvée system useful for diplomatic pressure. British newspapers published exposés starting in 1863. The London Times ran detailed accounts of working conditions, accompanied by illustrations showing Egyptian workers collapsed in the desert. British diplomats forwarded these reports to the Ottoman Sultan, framing French involvement in the canal as slavery under another name. The campaign put de Lesseps in an impossible position. He couldn't deny the corvée system existed because Egyptian law explicitly authorized it. He couldn't defend it as normal practice because international audiences were horrified. And he couldn't continue using forced labor without destroying the canal's reputation as a symbol of progress and cooperation. Napoleon III, who had endorsed the canal project in 1863, became nervous. French colonial policy in Algeria was already controversial. The French government couldn't afford to be associated with slavery accusations in Egypt too. In late 1863, Napoleon pressured de Lesseps to end the corvée system. De Lesseps stalled. Without forced labor, construction costs would explode. The canal company didn't have the capital to pay wages for 60,000 workers or to mechanize excavation. The entire financial model depended on Egypt providing free labor. Ismail Pasha, who became Egypt's ruler in January 1863 after Sa'id died, faced pressure from all sides. The Ottoman Sultan demanded he end the corvée. Britain threatened to support Ottoman intervention if forced labor continued. France wanted the canal finished but couldn't publicly support slavery. And de Lesseps insisted Egypt was obligated under the original concession to provide workers. In July 1864, Ismail abolished the corvée system for the canal project. The decision was announced as humanitarian reform. Egyptian workers would no longer be conscripted. The canal company would hire voluntary labor at market wages. International observers praised Ismail's enlightened leadership. British newspapers declared it a victory for civilized values. Then, de Lesseps presented the bill. The Suez Canal Company sued Egypt for breach of contract. The company claimed the original 1854 concession guaranteed access to corvée labor. By abolishing it, Egypt had violated the agreement and owed compensation for increased construction costs. Napoleon III agreed to arbitrate the dispute. In July 1864, the French emperor issued a ruling. Egypt would pay the Suez Canal Company 38 million francs in compensation, provide additional land grants along the canal route, and surrender control over the freshwater canal that supplied drinking water to the work camps. Read that carefully. Egypt paid nearly $80 million in today's money as compensation for ending slavery. Ismail had no choice but to accept. Refusing meant defaulting on the concession contract, which would trigger French military intervention. The Ottoman Sultan wouldn't defend Egypt against France. Britain would happily watch Egypt collapse under French pressure. So Ismail borrowed 38 million francs from European banks at brutal interest rates. Egypt paid the Suez Canal Company, and de Lesseps used the money to buy steam-powered dredgers from European manufacturers. Mechanization transformed the final phase of construction. The dredgers could excavate thousands of cubic yards per day, work that would have taken hundreds of men weeks to accomplish. French engineers celebrated technological triumph. European shareholders praised efficient progress. What nobody mentioned was that mechanization had been possible from the beginning. De Lesseps had chosen forced labor because it was free. When forced labor became politically impossible, he mechanized. The entire corvée system had been unnecessary except as a cost-saving measure that transferred construction expenses from French shareholders to Egyptian workers. The human cost was erased from official histories. French accounts of the canal's construction emphasize engineering innovation, international cooperation, and commercial vision. Egyptian accounts written decades later by historians like Al-Abbasi documented the deaths, the forced labor, and the financial manipulation. By 1869, when the canal finally opened, the question of how it was built had been buried beneath celebrations of what it represented. Europe saw the canal as proof of Western civilization's ability to reshape nature and connect continents. Egypt saw it as the physical manifestation of how European powers extracted wealth and labor while talking about partnership. Ahmed Hassan, the 19-year-old from the Nile Delta who was conscripted in 1861, died of cholera in a work camp in 1865. His name appears in no official French records. His mother's letter to regional authorities requesting information about his death was filed away and forgotten. He was one of tens of thousands, maybe one of 100,000. The exact number doesn't exist in any archive because no one with the power to document it cared enough to count. But every ship that passes through the Suez Canal today travels over a graveyard dug by forced labor. The engineering marvel was built on bodies that French shareholders never saw and Egyptian rulers tried to forget. And this was just the beginning of what Egypt would lose, because while workers were dying in the desert, a financial trap was being constructed that would cost Egypt everything. Ismail Pasha believed in numbers. When he became Egypt's Khedive in 1863, he commissioned detailed economic surveys of the country's resources. Egypt had 6 million people. It produced 500,000 tons of cotton annually. Tax revenue totaled 8 million Egyptian pounds per year. The Nile Delta had 3 million acres of agricultural land. The numbers looked strong. Egypt was the 13th wealthiest region in the Ottoman Empire. Cotton exports to Britain had doubled during the American Civil War. The country had infrastructure potential and a strategic location. What Ismail didn't calculate correctly was debt compounding at 20% interest. Let me show you how the trap worked. When Egypt abolished the corvée system in 1864 and paid 38 million francs to the Suez Canal Company, Ismail borrowed that money from European banks. The primary lender was the Anglo-Egyptian Bank, a British institution with offices in London and Cairo. The interest rate was 18% annually. The principal was 38 million francs. The repayment term was 10 years. By the time the loan matured in 1874, Egypt would owe 92 million francs in principal and interest combined. That's 2.4 times the original loan amount. Egypt was paying 92 million francs to borrow 38 million. This wasn't unusual for the time. European banks routinely charged 15 to 25% interest on loans to non-European governments, justified by currency risk and political instability. What made Egypt's situation catastrophic was the volume of borrowing. Between 1863 and 1873, Ismail borrowed £400 million through various European banks. That's roughly $50 billion in today's money. He used the money to modernize Egypt's infrastructure at a pace that would have bankrupted nations twice as wealthy. Ismail built 650 miles of railway. He expanded irrigation canals across the delta. He constructed telegraph lines connecting Cairo to Alexandria, Suez and Aswan. He established Egypt's first postal service. He opened government schools, including the first institutions for women's education. He modernized Cairo with gas streetlights, wide boulevards and a water supply system. And he spent £2 million hosting the Suez Canal opening ceremony in November 1869. Every project was financed with borrowed money at interest rates that made repayment mathematically impossible unless Egypt's tax revenue grew exponentially. Ismail believed it would. Cotton prices had peaked during the American Civil War. If those prices held, Egypt's export revenue would cover the debt easily. The prices didn't hold. When the American Civil War ended in 1865, Confederate cotton flooded back into global markets. Egyptian cotton prices collapsed. By 1866, prices had fallen 60% from their wartime peak. Egypt's export revenue dropped proportionally. But Egypt's debt service didn't. The loans were denominated in British pounds and French francs, with fixed interest rates and repayment schedules. Egypt owed the same amount regardless of cotton prices. Ismail tried to compensate by raising taxes. He increased land taxes, customs duties, and introduced new levies on agricultural production. Tax revenue climbed from £8 million in 1863 to £12 million by 1870. But debt service was consuming £10 million annually by 1870. Egypt was collecting £12 million in taxes and immediately paying out £10 million to European creditors. The situation was unsustainable. European banks knew it. British and French financial authorities tracked Egypt's debt-to-revenue ratio closely. By 1873, Egypt's total debt exceeded £300 million. Annual debt service was £14 million. Tax revenue was £13 million. Egypt was spending more servicing debt than it collected in total government revenue. Ismail tried desperate measures. He sold state assets. He leased government monopolies on commodities like sugar and tobacco to European companies for upfront cash. He issued new bonds at increasingly punitive interest rates, using the money from new loans to pay interest on old ones. This is the classic debt spiral. Borrow to pay existing debt, accumulate more debt, borrow again at higher rates because creditors recognize the risk. Eventually, the borrower has no assets left to sell and no creditors willing to lend. Egypt reached that point in 1875. By November 1875, Egypt faced an immediate crisis. A loan payment of 30 million francs to French creditors was due in December. Egypt didn't have the money. Ismail had exhausted his borrowing capacity. European banks refused new loans without collateral. The only significant asset Egypt still controlled was its shares in the Suez Canal Company. 44% of the company, worth approximately 100 million francs on paper. Ismail explored selling the shares quietly. He approached French banks first, since France already owned the majority of Canal shares. French financiers offered 50 million francs, half the shares' nominal value, knowing Ismail was desperate. Ismail hesitated. Selling to France would give them complete control over the canal. He considered approaching the Ottoman Sultan, but Constantinople had no interest in owning canal shares, and even less capacity to pay for them. Russia had money but would alarm Britain. Germany wasn't interested in Egyptian infrastructure. That left Britain. British intelligence had been monitoring Egypt's financial collapse for years. The Foreign Office received monthly reports from the British Consul General in Cairo, detailing Egypt's debt levels, tax revenue, and political stability. British banks held portions of Egypt's debt. British shipping companies were the canal's largest users, accounting for nearly 80% of traffic by 1875. Britain had opposed the canal initially, but now depended on it strategically. Ships traveling from London to Bombay saved 41 days using the Suez route versus sailing around Africa. That meant faster mail delivery to India, faster deployment of troops to British colonies in Asia, and faster extraction of resources from territories like India, Burma, and Malaya. The canal was no longer a threat to British interests. It was essential to maintaining the empire. But France controlled the canal through majority share ownership. Word reached London in early November 1875 that Ismail was considering selling Egypt's shares. The intelligence came through a French banker who had rejected Ismail's overture and then leaked the information to a British contact, hoping to profit from the resulting chaos. Frederick Greenwood, editor of the Pall Mall Gazette newspaper in London, received the tip. He immediately went to see Baron Lionel de Rothschild, head of the British branch of the Rothschild banking family. Rothschild confirmed through his Paris contacts that Ismail was indeed desperate to sell. Greenwood then went to 10 Downing Street to see Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli. It was November 14, 1875. Parliament was not in session. Disraeli had no authority to commit government funds without parliamentary approval. Normal procedure would require weeks of debate, committee review and formal appropriation. By that time, France would buy the shares or another party would intervene. Disraeli made a decision in approximately 20 minutes that would reshape the British Empire. He authorized the purchase of Egypt's canal shares for £4 million. He had no approved budget for this expenditure. Parliament wouldn't reconvene for weeks. He needed the money immediately because Ismail, once word got out, would face multiple offers. Disraeli sent a note to Lionel de Rothschild. "It is just settled. You have it, madam." The message was coded but clear. Rothschild would loan the British government £4 million. The transaction would occur immediately. Parliament would be informed after the fact. Rothschild agreed within hours. The Rothschild Bank would loan Britain £4 million at 5% interest, with the Egyptian canal shares serving as collateral until Parliament approved the expenditure and repaid the loan. The British Consul General in Cairo, Major Evelyn Baring, received a coded telegram on November 18. "Purchase authorized. Proceed immediately." Baring met with Ismail on November 25. The negotiation lasted 3 hours. Ismail wanted £4 million cash. Britain offered £3,900,000. Ismail accepted. The deal was signed November 25, 1875. Britain now owned 44% of the Suez Canal Company. The transaction was announced publicly on November 26. French newspapers exploded in fury. The French government filed a diplomatic protest, claiming Britain had acted in bad faith by secretly purchasing shares that France should have been offered first. The Ottoman Sultan was bewildered, unsure whether to protest British interference in Egyptian affairs or be relieved that Egypt's debt was partially resolved. British newspapers celebrated Disraeli's boldness. The Times called it the greatest political transaction of the century. Punch magazine published a cartoon showing Disraeli presenting Queen Victoria with a map labeled "New Highway to India." Egypt received £4 million, which Ismail immediately used to pay the most urgent French creditors. The money bought Egypt 6 months of breathing room. It didn't solve the fundamental problem. Egypt still owed £300 million to various European creditors and had no way to repay it. What Egypt had done was sell the only asset that generated reliable revenue. The canal shares paid dividends annually based on transit fees. Those dividends would have grown as canal traffic increased. By selling the shares, Egypt traded long-term income for short-term debt relief. It was the worst financial decision Ismail could have made, but he had no alternatives left. Britain, meanwhile, had acquired strategic control over the most important waterway in the world for the equivalent of $500 million in today's money. France still owned the majority of shares, but Britain now had veto power over major company decisions and a permanent seat on the Canal Company board. More importantly, Britain now had a financial stake that justified military intervention to protect. This would become critical within 6 years when Egypt's government collapsed completely. But in November 1875, the immediate crisis appeared resolved. Ismail had cash. Britain had canal shares. France was furious, but had no legal grounds to reverse the sale. What nobody fully grasped yet was that this transaction had just made Egypt a British target. The debt hadn't disappeared. The European creditors still demanded payment. And Britain, now holding canal shares as a strategic asset, had every incentive to ensure Egypt remained stable enough to keep the canal operating, even if that meant controlling Egypt directly. The financial trap was about to become a military occupation, and Egypt, celebrating the temporary reprieve from bankruptcy, didn't see it coming. Benjamin Disraeli understood debt as leverage, As Prime Minister in 1875, he saw Egypt's financial crisis not as a distant colonial problem, but as an opportunity to secure Britain's route to India without firing a shot. The canal share purchase in November 1875 was step one. Step two was turning financial control into political control. And step three, which Disraeli planned meticulously, was making Egypt a British protectorate in everything but name. Parliament, when it reconvened in February 1876, erupted over Disraeli's unauthorized purchase. Liberal opposition members demanded to know why the Prime Minister had committed £4 million without parliamentary approval. William Gladstone, Disraeli's political rival, called it an unconstitutional adventure undertaken in secrecy. Disraeli's response was brilliant political theatre. He stood in the House of Commons and framed the purchase as defending British imperial interests against French commercial dominance. Allowing France complete control would have been strategic malpractice of the highest order. The Commons voted to ratify the purchase, 280 to 185. Britain officially owned Egypt's canal shares, but shares alone didn't give Britain the control Disraeli wanted. France still owned 52% of the Suez Canal Company. The company board, dominated by French directors, set transit fees, operational policy, and dividend distribution. Britain had veto power over major decisions, but couldn't dictate daily operations. What Britain needed was leverage over Egypt itself. That leverage arrived in April 1876, when Egypt defaulted on a bond payment to European creditors. Ismail simply didn't have the money. He'd used the £4 million from the share sale to pay the most urgent French debts. Other creditors, holding bonds worth millions, received nothing. European bondholders went directly to their governments. France and Britain, whose citizens held the majority of Egyptian bonds, faced domestic political pressure to protect investors. The solution was simple and devastating: impose direct European control over Egyptian finances. In May 1876, Britain and France jointly established the Caisse de la Dette Publique, the Public Debt Commission. This organization, staffed by European financial controllers, would directly manage Egypt's revenue collection and debt repayment. Egypt's tax income would go to the Caisse first. The Caisse would pay European creditors. Whatever remained would go to Egypt's government for operating expenses. Ismail had no power to refuse. Defaulting further would trigger military intervention. The Ottoman Sultan, under pressure from European diplomats, ordered Ismail to accept the Caisse's authority. Egypt had just lost control of its own tax revenue. Baring was a career colonial administrator who had served in India. He understood imperial finance intimately: conquer through debt, control through administration, extract wealth through bureaucracy. Baring's reports to London in 1876 and 1877 paint a clear picture of his strategy. Egypt, he wrote, was financially insolvent and politically incompetent. European supervision was essential to protect legitimate commercial interests. And Britain, as the canal's largest user and a major creditor, had both the right and the obligation to ensure stable governance. Translation: Britain intended to run Egypt. The Caisse implemented brutal financial discipline. Egypt's government budget was slashed. Infrastructure projects were cancelled. Government salaries were cut. The Egyptian army was reduced from 60,000 troops to 36,000. Schools and hospitals lost funding. All available revenue went to European creditors. By 1878, Egypt was paying £17 million annually in debt service out of total tax revenue of £19 million. The Egyptian government had £2 million to run the entire country, pay the military, maintain infrastructure, and provide basic services. Ismail tried to resist. He appointed nationalist ministers who argued Egypt should default completely and renegotiate debt on favorable terms. He explored seeking support from the Ottoman Sultan or even Russia to counterbalance British and French pressure. Every attempt failed. The Caisse controlled the money. Britain and France controlled the Caisse, and Ismail controlled nothing. In June 1878, under pressure from Britain and France, Ismail was forced to accept a new arrangement: the dual control. This system placed British and French financial advisors directly into Egypt's government as cabinet ministers. The British controller oversaw revenue collection. The French controller managed expenditures. Egypt's government was now run by foreign appointees who answered to foreign capitals. Evelyn Baring, promoted to British Controller General, moved into offices in Cairo with authority over Egypt's entire financial system. He could approve or veto any government expenditure. He set tax rates. He controlled customs duties. He managed state assets. Ismail was Khedive in title only. Real power belonged to Baring and his French counterpart. The situation was colonialism without formal annexation. Britain and France controlled Egypt's government, extracted its wealth, and dictated policy, all while maintaining the fiction that Ismail remained the sovereign ruler. Ottoman suzerainty existed on paper. In practice, Egypt was a European financial protectorate. Then, in February 1879, Egyptian army officers rebelled. The rebellion wasn't nationalist in the modern sense. It was a direct response to salary cuts. The case had reduced military pay to free up revenue for debt service. Officers who had received £40 monthly now received 20. Enlisted soldiers saw their pay cut in half. Colonel Ahmed Urabi, a mid-ranking officer from a peasant background, emerged as the rebellion's spokesman. Urabi was 38-year-old, charismatic, and increasingly angry about European control. He organized a demonstration of 4,000 soldiers outside Ismail's palace, demanding restoration of military pay and dismissal of foreign controllers. Ismail, seeing an opportunity to regain power, supported the officers. He dismissed the British and French controllers in April 1879 and appointed a nationalist cabinet. He announced that Egypt would renegotiate its debts on Egyptian terms, not European ones. Britain and France responded immediately. Both governments sent diplomatic notes to the Ottoman Sultan: remove Ismail from power or face joint military intervention. The Sultan, under pressure and fearing European occupation of Ottoman territory, issued a decree on June 26, 1879. Ismail was deposed. His son Tewfik, a pliable 27-year-old with no political base, became the new Khedive. Ismail left Egypt on June 30, 1879, boarding a ship for Naples. He would spend the rest of his life in exile, dying in Constantinople in 1895. His 17-year rule had transformed Egypt's infrastructure and bankrupted its government. He built railways and telegraphs and schools while accumulating £300 million in debt. And he'd lost Egypt's sovereignty trying to keep up with European standards of modernity. Tewfik, the new Khedive, immediately reinstated the dual control. Evelyn Baring returned to Cairo with expanded authority. Egypt's nationalist ministers were dismissed. European financial controllers resumed managing Egypt's revenue. But the nationalist movement Ismail had briefly empowered didn't disappear. Colonel Urabi, dismissed from his military post, continued organizing. Egyptian intellectuals, merchants, and low-ranking officials increasingly resented European domination. And in 1881, that resentment would explode into open revolt. What's crucial to understand is Britain's calculated patience during this period. Disraeli, the architect of the Canal share purchase, died in April 1881. William Gladstone, his Liberal rival, became Prime Minister. Gladstone publicly opposed imperial expansion and advocated for moral governance in foreign policy. But Gladstone, like Disraeli, understood strategic necessity. The canal wasn't optional for British imperial communications. Egypt's stability wasn't optional for canal operations. And if stability required direct British military control, Gladstone would authorize it regardless of his anti-imperial rhetoric. The opportunity arrived in 1882 with the Urabi Revolt. Colonel Urabi, now promoted to general by Egyptian nationalist officers, led a military coup in September 1881. He seized control of Egypt's government and declared an end to European financial supervision. He demanded that Tewfik rule as a constitutional monarch with parliamentary oversight. He announced plans to default on Egypt's European debt and renegotiate on Egyptian terms. Tewfik fled to Alexandria and requested British protection. Britain and France sent naval squadrons to Alexandria in May 1882, ostensibly to protect European nationals. The warships anchored in Alexandria harbor with guns trained on the city. The implicit threat was clear: Urabi's government would accept European authority or face bombardment. Urabi refused. Egyptian forces began fortifying Alexandria's defenses. On June 11, 1882, riots erupted in Alexandria. European residents were attacked. 50 Europeans and 250 Egyptians died in the violence. Britain used the riots as justification for military intervention. On July 11, 1882, British warships bombarded Alexandria for 10 hours. The city's fortifications were destroyed. Buildings burned. Egyptian casualties exceeded 2,000. Urabi's forces retreated toward Cairo. Then Britain did something France didn't expect. It invaded alone. France had participated in the naval demonstration but declined to send ground troops, politically unwilling to engage in a land war in Egypt. Britain, under Gladstone's authorization, sent 25,000 troops under General Garnet Wolseley. British forces landed at Port Said in August 1882, secured the Suez Canal, and marched toward Cairo. Egyptian troops under Urabi attempted to defend at Tel el-Kebir, 40 miles northeast of Cairo. The Battle of Tel el-Kebir on September 13, 1882, lasted less than an hour. British forces, using modern rifles and artillery against Egyptian troops with outdated weapons, killed 2,000 Egyptians while suffering 57 casualties. Urabi surrendered. He was tried for rebellion. Convicted and exiled to Ceylon, British troops entered Cairo on September 15, 1882. Tawfiq was restored as Khedive, completely dependent on British military protection. Evelyn Baring, now promoted to Consul General and given the title Lord Cromer, became Egypt's effective ruler. Britain announced the occupation was temporary, intended only to restore order and protect European interests. British troops would withdraw once stability was ensured. They stayed for 72 years. Egypt was now a British protectorate in all but name. The Ottoman Sultan retained nominal suzerainty. Tawfiq remained Khedive with ceremonial authority. But real power, military, financial, political, belonged to Lord Cromer and the British occupation force. The Suez Canal, built by Egypt with Egyptian labor and Egyptian money, was now controlled by Britain through military force. Transit fees enriched the Suez Canal Company's European shareholders, while Egypt received nothing. British troops guarded the canal zone. British warships patrolled Egyptian waters. British administrators managed Egyptian finances. And every year, Egypt paid £17 million to European creditors, while its own population struggled with reduced government services, economic stagnation, and foreign occupation. Disraeli's vision, executed through financial leverage and military intervention, was complete. Britain controlled Egypt without formally annexing it, avoiding the diplomatic complications of outright colonialism while extracting all the benefits. France, furious at being outmaneuvered, still owned majority canal shares, but lacked military presence to challenge British control. The Ottoman Empire protested, but had no power to intervene. Egypt itself had become a ghost state, sovereign on paper, occupied in practice. The canal was British. Egypt was British. And this arrangement would persist until a new generation of Egyptian nationalists, led by a young army officer named Gamal Abdel Nasser, decided enough was enough. But that confrontation was still 70 years away. Evelyn Baring, now Lord Cromer, ruled Egypt from 1883 to 1907 with an authority that exceeded most colonial governors elsewhere in the British Empire. His title was Consul General, a diplomatic position that theoretically carried no governing power. In practice, Cromer ran Egypt as a personal fiefdom. He answered directly to the Foreign Office in London. The Khedive, technically Egypt's ruler, required Cromer's approval for any significant decision. Egyptian ministers held office only with Cromer's consent. The Egyptian parliament, established briefly during Tawfiq's reign, was dissolved. Egypt's government became an administrative apparatus executing British policy. This was colonialism's sophisticated phase. Indirect rule that maintained local facades while centralizing power in British hands. Cromer's philosophy, articulated in reports to London, was brutally clear. Egyptians were incapable of self-government and required British guidance to achieve civilized standards. His administration would focus on three priorities: maintaining canal security, ensuring debt repayment to European creditors, and extracting Egypt's agricultural wealth efficiently. Education, healthcare, and Egyptian political development were explicitly deprioritized. The numbers tell the story. Between 1882 and 1907, British administration in Egypt collected £3 billion in total revenue. Of that, £1.8 billion went to European creditors as debt service. Another £600 million funded the British occupation force and administrative costs. Egypt's own development budget, schools, hospitals, infrastructure, received £600 million over 25 years. Egypt was generating massive wealth. Britain and European creditors were extracting it. Egypt was generating massive wealth. Britain and European creditors were extracting it. Cotton production. Egypt's primary export was reorganized to serve British textile mills. Egyptian farmers were required to grow long, staple cotton varieties that British factories preferred. Export quotas were set to ensure steady supply to Liverpool and Manchester. Egyptian cotton that might have been processed domestically was instead shipped raw to Britain, processed there, and sometimes sold back to Egypt as finished textiles at markup. This was classic colonial extraction. Take raw materials, add value elsewhere, capture the profit. Kroma blocked industrialization in Egypt deliberately. When Egyptian entrepreneurs proposed building textile mills to process cotton domestically, Kroma's administration denied the necessary permits. British officials argued that Egypt's comparative advantage was agriculture and industrial development would be economically inefficient. Translation: Britain didn't want competition for its own textile industry. Egyptian agricultural production surged under British administration, but Egyptian farmers didn't benefit proportionally. Kroma reformed the tax system to increase revenue extraction. Land taxes increased 40% between 1883 and 1900. Farmers who couldn't pay lost their land to European creditors or Egyptian elites connected to the British administration. By 1907, 70% of Egypt's agricultural land was owned by 5% of the population. Most of that elite 5% were closely tied to British commercial interests or were British subjects themselves. The human impact was devastating. Egyptian peasants, the fellahin, worked land they didn't own, growing crops whose profits they didn't share. Malnutrition was common. Child mortality exceeded 30% in rural areas. Infectious diseases like bilharzia and trachoma were endemic. Kroma's administration spent less than 3% of annual revenue on public health. British officials justified this by claiming Egyptians didn't value Western medicine. The reality was budget allocation reflected priorities. Canal security and debt repayment came first. Egyptian welfare last. Education policy was even more restrictive. Kroma believed mass education would create political unrest. His administration limited primary school enrollment, restricted secondary education to the elite, and actively discouraged university attendance. By 1907, Egypt had fewer than 4,000 students in secondary schools nationwide, serving a population of 11 million. Literacy rates stagnated at around 8%. Meanwhile, British administrators established an English-language education track for elite Egyptian families who collaborated with the occupation. These families sent their sons to British-supervised schools, learned English, and entered colonial administration as junior officials. They became a comprador class, economically dependent on British rule and politically disconnected from the broader Egyptian population. This created a social fracture that would haunt Egypt for decades. A Western-educated elite aligned with colonial interests versus a rural majority increasingly resentful of foreign domination. The Suez Canal during this period became a British military corridor. Traffic increased dramatically as imperial trade routes consolidated. By 1900, 10,000 ships annually passed through the canal, 75% flying British flags. The canal zone itself was transformed into a fortified British enclave. Troops stationed at Port Said, Ismailia, and Suez lived in segregated cantonments with British amenities, clubs, cricket grounds, churches. Egyptian workers who serviced the zone lived in adjacent slums with no running water or electricity. The contrast was visual apartheid. British administrators and their families enjoyed colonial comfort. Egyptian laborers lived in conditions that would have shocked contemporary observers in London. Canal revenue during Kroma's tenure totaled over £200 million. Egypt, which built the canal and provided the land, received nothing beyond the initial £4 million paid for the shares sold to Britain in 1875. The Suez Canal Company, still majority French-owned, paid dividends to European shareholders. Britain collected strategic benefits without direct financial extraction from the canal itself. The entire Egyptian economy served that function. French resentment of British dominance festered but never materialized into action. France still owned 52% of canal shares and held board positions in the Suez Canal Company. But Britain's military occupation gave it operational control. French shareholders collected dividends while British warships secured the route. The arrangement satisfied neither party but worked pragmatically. Nationalist opposition to British rule during Cromer's tenure was suppressed systematically. After Urabi's defeat in 1882, Egyptian nationalism went underground. Secret societies formed. Intellectuals published anti-occupation pamphlets. Students organized protests. Cromer's response was surveillance and censorship. The Egyptian police, commanded by British officers, monitored nationalist groups. Publications critical of British rule were banned. Public gatherings required permits that were routinely denied. Egyptians suspected of nationalist sympathies lost government positions. Political resistance was criminalized as sedition. One incident from 1906 illustrates the system's brutality. In the village of Denshawai, British officers went pigeon hunting, a sport the officers considered recreational but villagers saw as shooting their livestock. A confrontation occurred. One British officer died, possibly from heat stroke while pursuing villagers. British authorities arrested 52 villagers. The trial was a show proceeding. 4 villagers were hanged. Others received flogging and hard labor sentences. The hangings were carried out in Denshawai, with the entire village forced to watch. The Denshawai incident became symbolic of British occupation's arbitrary violence. Egyptian intellectuals used it to mobilize anti-British sentiment. The event radicalized a generation of Egyptian students who would later form the nationalist movement, but immediate resistance remained futile. Britain had 30,000 troops in Egypt by 1900. The Egyptian army, reduced to 12,000 men under British command, existed primarily for internal policing. Egyptians held junior ranks. British officers commanded. Any serious rebellion would be crushed militarily. What changed the dynamic wasn't Egyptian resistance. It was World War I. When war erupted in 1914, Britain formalized what had been true since 1882. The legal fiction of Ottoman suzerainty was abolished. Britain declared Egypt under direct British protection, severing the nominal Ottoman connection. Egypt became a British war base. Over 1 million Egyptian workers were conscripted for labor battalions supporting British operations in Palestine, Mesopotamia, and Europe. Egyptian agricultural production was redirected to feed British troops. The Suez Canal became a critical military corridor for moving troops and supplies between the European and Asian theaters. Egypt didn't benefit from this mobilization. Egyptian workers received minimal pay. Agricultural requisitions reduced food supplies domestically, causing shortages and inflation. And Egyptians had no say in how their country was used for a war they hadn't chosen. By 1918, when World War I ended, Egypt had contributed labor, resources, and strategic infrastructure to the British war effort without receiving recognition as an ally or compensation for the economic disruption. Egyptian nationalists, watching the post-war peace process, expected independence. American President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points promised self-determination for peoples under imperial rule. Surely, Egyptian leaders reasoned, this principle applied to Egypt. It didn't. Britain had no intention of relinquishing Egypt. The canal was too strategically valuable. Egyptian cotton was too economically important, and British officials believed Egyptian self-governance would inevitably lead to chaos and threaten British interests. So when Egyptian nationalist leader Saad Zarglu requested permission to attend the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 to present Egypt's case for independence, British authorities refused and arrested him. The arrest triggered the 1919 Egyptian Revolution. Students in Cairo walked out of classes, lawyers went on strike, workers abandoned jobs. Demonstrations spread from Cairo to Alexandria, Aswan, and rural villages. The protests were initially peaceful. Strikes, boycotts, marches. British authorities responded with force. Troops fired on demonstrators. Over 800 Egyptians were killed in the first month of protests. Thousands were arrested. The violence radicalized the movement. Sabotage increased. Railway lines were cut. Telegraph wires were destroyed. British officials were attacked. Britain sent reinforcements and declared martial law. By summer 1919, British troops had restored order through mass arrests and military occupation of major cities. But Britain faced an international embarrassment. The League of Nations was being established to promote self-determination. British officials were advocating for democratic governance globally while crushing democratic protests in Egypt. The contradiction became diplomatically untenable. In 1922, Britain granted Egypt nominal independence. The protectorate was formally dissolved. Egypt became a constitutional monarchy under King Fuad, Tewfik's successor. A parliament was established with elected representatives, but Britain retained control over 4 reserved points: defense of Egypt, protection of foreign interests, protection of minorities, and control of Sudan. British troops remained stationed throughout Egypt. The Suez Canal stayed under British military protection. Egyptian independence was cosmetic. Real power remained in British hands. The 1922 arrangement satisfied no one. Egyptian nationalists saw it as fake independence. British officials resented having to negotiate at all, and the stage was set for ongoing conflict that would define Egyptian politics for the next 3 decades. What Cromer had built, a colonial system disguised as administrative assistance, had lasted 40 years. It enriched Britain, impoverished Egypt, and created institutional resentments that persisted long after British troops finally left. But that departure was still decades away. And before it happened, one more crisis over the canal would bring the world to the brink of global war. The 1922 independence settlement created an impossible political structure. Egypt had a king, a parliament, and a prime minister, but Britain retained military bases, controlled foreign policy, and occupied the Suez Canal zone with 40,000 troops. This was sovereignty without power. Egyptian politics between 1922 and 1952 revolved around one question: how to remove British military presence while avoiding the economic collapse or military intervention that outright defiance would trigger. The Wafed Party, Egypt's largest nationalist movement, pursued negotiation. Founded by Saad Zaghloul after the 1919 revolution, the Wafed won every genuinely free election held during this period. Its platform was simple: complete British withdrawal, full Egyptian sovereignty, and democratic governance. Britain refused all 3 demands. King Fuad, and later his son Farouk, collaborated with Britain to maintain the monarchy's power. The kings understood that British military presence guaranteed their thrones against internal challenges, so they aligned with British interests, appointed pro-British prime ministers when Wafed won elections, and used British backing to suppress political opponents. Egyptian democracy became a performance. Elections happened, but British officials and the palace manipulated outcomes. Economic control remained British throughout this period. Egypt's cotton exports still went primarily to British mills. British banks dominated Egyptian finance. The Suez Canal Company, still majority French-owned but British-protected, paid Egypt nothing beyond nominal fees for land use. By 1936, canal revenue exceeded £30 million annually. Egypt received £300,000. That ratio, 1% going to Egypt, 99% to European shareholders, was mathematically indefensible and politically toxic. Younger Egyptian officers watching this exploitation grew increasingly radicalized. These men, mostly from middle-class backgrounds, had attended Egyptian military academies and resented the British officers who still commanded senior positions. They saw the canal as a symbol of national humiliation. One of these officers was Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser was born in 1918 in Alexandria. The son of a postal worker, he grew up during the 1919 revolution and the subsequent independence settlement. He attended the Royal Military Academy in Cairo, graduating in 1938 as a second lieutenant. His service in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War was politically transformative. Egyptian forces fought poorly in that war, hampered by inadequate equipment, poor command, and political interference. Nasser, serving as a battalion commander, was surrounded with his unit at Fallujah for months. He attributed the military failure to Egypt's political leadership, which he saw as corrupt and subservient to British interests. After the war, Nasser helped found the Free Officers Movement, a secret organization of military officers committed to overthrowing King Farouk and ending British occupation. The movement recruited carefully, drawing from mid-ranking officers who shared grievances about British dominance and royal incompetence. By 1952, the Free Officers had 300 members and a simple plan: military coup, abolish the monarchy, negotiate British withdrawal. The coup happened on July 23, 1952. Free Officers units seized control of military headquarters, radio stations, and government buildings in Cairo. There was minimal resistance. Farouk, aware he had no popular support and no British commitment to save him, abdicated and left Egypt on July 26. The monarchy was finished. Egypt became a republic. The Revolutionary Command Council, led nominally by General Mohammed Naguib, but effectively controlled by Nasser, immediately announced its priorities: land reform to break up elite estates, industrialization to reduce dependence on cotton exports, and British military withdrawal. Britain, now led by Conservative Prime Minister Winston Churchill, initially dismissed the coup as another Middle Eastern power struggle. British officials assumed the new military government would soon need British economic support and military protection, creating leverage for a negotiated settlement that preserved British interests. They were wrong. Nasser, who became Prime Minister in 1954 after sidelining Naguib, proved to be a sophisticated international operator. He played Cold War superpowers against each other. He aligned Egypt with a non-aligned movement, refusing to join either Western or Soviet blocs. And he used the threat of Soviet friendship to extract concessions from the West. The strategy worked brilliantly. In 1954, Britain agreed to withdraw all troops from Egypt except the Suez Canal zone. Negotiations for complete withdrawal began. By 1956, Britain committed to evacuating Canal Zone bases by June 1956, ending 74 years of military occupation. But Britain retained ownership of the Suez Canal through shares in the Suez Canal Company, and Britain insisted on treaty provisions allowing military return if the canal's operations were threatened. Nasser saw this as neo-colonialism, with better public relations. Meanwhile, Egypt's economic situation remained desperate. The country needed massive investment in infrastructure, particularly the Aswan High Dam project, which would regulate Nile flooding, generate electricity, and expand agricultural land. The dam would cost $1 billion. Egypt didn't have it. Nasser initially negotiated funding from the United States and the World Bank. The Eisenhower administration, hoping to keep Egypt in the Western orbit, offered $56 million in initial funding, with World Bank support for the remainder. But Nasser's neutralist foreign policy alienated American officials. In 1955, Egypt purchased weapons from Czechoslovakia, a Soviet ally, after Western powers refused to sell on acceptable terms. Nasser recognized Communist China. He criticized Western colonialism publicly at the Bandung Conference, aligning Egypt with Asian and African independence movements. American Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, a fierce Cold Warrior, saw Nasser as dangerously pro-Soviet. In July 1956, Dulles abruptly withdrew the American offer to fund the Aswan Dam. The World Bank immediately followed suit. Egypt's signature development project was dead. Nasser had two choices: accept economic stagnation or find alternative funding. He chose a third option: nationalize the Suez Canal. On July 26, 1956, speaking to a crowd in Alexandria on the 4th anniversary of Farouk's abdication, Nasser announced that Egypt was seizing control of the Suez Canal Company. All company assets in Egypt would become Egyptian state property. Egypt would operate the canal and collect all transit fees. Revenue would fund the Aswan Dam. The speech was broadcast on Egyptian radio. As Nasser spoke the code word de Lesseps, Egyptian troops moved to occupy Canal Company offices in Port Said, Ismailia, and Suez. They took control without resistance. European staff were offered continued employment under Egyptian management or safe passage out of the country. The canal's nationalization was complete within hours. Nasser justified the action legally and politically. The Suez Canal Company's original concession, granted by Ismail in 1854, expired in 1968. Egypt was simply terminating the concession 12 years early. Egypt would compensate shareholders at market value, and Egypt, as a sovereign nation, had absolute right to control infrastructure on its own territory. International legal experts largely agreed. Nationalization of private companies operating on sovereign territory was legal under international law, provided compensation was fair. But Britain and France weren't interested in legal arguments. British Prime Minister Anthony Eden compared Nasser to Hitler. French officials, already fighting a brutal colonial war in Algeria, where Nasser supported independence movements, saw the canal seizure as an attack on French interests. Both governments declared the nationalization unacceptable. Eden told his cabinet on July 27 that Britain should prepare military action to retake the canal. The canal, he argued, was the great imperial lifeline. Allowing Egypt to control it would signal British imperial decline and encourage independence movements throughout British colonies. France agreed immediately. Both nations began mobilizing military forces. The United States, under President Dwight Eisenhower, urged restraint. Eisenhower, despite his Cold War anti-Soviet positions, opposed European colonialism. He saw Eden's plan to use military force as late 19th century imperialism that would alienate the entire developing world and push Egypt toward the Soviet Union. Eisenhower pressured Britain and France to seek diplomatic resolution. But Eden, politically committed to forceful response, coordinated secretly with France and Israel. The plan, later revealed as the Protocol of Sèvres, was cynical and illegal. Israel would invade Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. Britain and France would then issue an ultimatum demanding both sides withdraw from the canal zone. When Egypt refused, Britain and France would intervene militarily to separate the combatants and retake the canal. It was colonialism disguised as peacekeeping,
which had its own grievances with Egypt over border skirmishes and the blockade of Israeli shipping through the Straits of Tiran, agreed to participate. Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion saw the operation as an opportunity to weaken Egypt militarily and secure Israel's southern border. The three nations finalized their plan in October 1956. Nasser, through intelligence reports, knew an attack was coming but miscalculated its timing and scale. He believed Britain and France were bluffing, that international pressure would prevent military action. He fortified the canal zone, mobilized Egyptian forces, and prepared for potential conflict. But he didn't expect Israel to invade first. On October 29, 1956, Israeli forces crossed into Sinai, advancing rapidly toward the Suez Canal. Egyptian troops, caught by surprise, retreated in disorder. Within 48 hours, Israeli units were approaching the canal zone. Britain and France issued their planned ultimatum on October 30. Both Egypt and Israel must withdraw from the canal zone within 12 hours or face Anglo-French military intervention. Israel, which was already advancing toward the canal as agreed in the secret plan, immediately accepted. Egypt, which was defending its own territory, refused. On October 31, British and French aircraft.
The Suez Crisis lasted 120 days from nationalization to complete Western withdrawal. But its consequences reshaped global politics for decades. Britain's humiliation was total. Anthony Eden, physically and politically broken, resigned as Prime Minister in January 1957. His Conservative Party spent years recovering from the strategic disaster. British prestige internationally was shattered. The crisis proved that Britain could no longer act as an imperial power without American approval. The special relationship between Britain and the United States was revealed as fundamentally unequal. Britain needed American economic support more than America needed British alliance. For the British public, Suez marked the psychological end of empire. If Britain couldn't control a canal it had dominated for 80 years, what else was slipping away? Decolonization accelerated. Ghana became independent in 1957, Malaya in 1957, Nigeria in 1960. Within 15 years, most of the British Empire had dissolved. Historians debate how much Suez directly caused this acceleration versus revealing processes already underway, but the connection was clear to contemporaries. France's position was equally damaged. French officials, already losing control in Algeria, saw Suez as another humiliating retreat from colonial commitments. The crisis strengthened French determination to develop independent military capabilities, particularly nuclear weapons, to avoid future dependence on American approval. Charles de Gaulle, who returned to power in France in 1958, explicitly cited Suez as justification for France's independent nuclear deterrent and withdrawal from NATO's integrated military command. For the United States, Suez was a strategic victory wrapped in diplomatic complexity. Eisenhower had prevented a Soviet-backed Egypt from aligning more closely with Moscow by opposing European colonial aggression. American prestige in the developing world surged, but Eisenhower had also damaged relations with Britain and France, America's closest allies. The tension between supporting decolonization and maintaining alliances with colonial powers would define American Cold War policy for years. The Soviet Union gained influence without firing a shot. By threatening intervention and supporting Egypt diplomatically, the Soviets positioned themselves as defenders of Arab nationalism. Soviet-Egyptian relations warmed dramatically. By 1958, the Soviet Union was providing military aid, economic assistance, and eventually funding for the Aswan High Dam that the West had refused. Israel's position was complex. The military operation had been successful. Israeli forces had devastated Egyptian positions in Sinai, but international pressure forced complete withdrawal with minimal territorial or strategic gains. Israeli leaders concluded they couldn't rely on British or French support in future conflicts and needed to cultivate the American relationship more carefully. The United Nations Emergency Force, established to supervise the ceasefire, became the first major UN peacekeeping operation. 6,000 peacekeepers from neutral nations were deployed along the Egyptian-Israeli border. The precedent would shape UN peacekeeping for decades. For Egypt and Nasser personally, Suez was transformative. Militarily, Egypt had been defeated. Egyptian forces performed poorly against Israeli troops. British and French forces had seized the northern canal zone before political pressure halted the invasion. The Egyptian Air Force was destroyed on the ground in the first hours of Anglo-French bombing. But politically and psychologically, Nasser had won completely. He'd defied three major powers, Britain, France, and Israel, and survived. The canal remained nationalized. Egypt retained sovereignty. And Nasser emerged as the unquestioned leader of Arab nationalism and anti-colonial resistance. His popularity across the Arab world exploded. Portraits of Nasser appeared in streets from Morocco to Iraq. Radio Cairo, broadcasting Nasser's speeches throughout the Middle East, became the voice of Arab unity and resistance to Western imperialism. The Suez Canal itself reopened under Egyptian management in April 1957. Egyptian engineers and pilots trained hastily during the crisis operated the canal efficiently. Traffic resumed at pre-crisis levels within months. Britain and France had insisted that Egyptians lacked the technical expertise to run the canal. They were wrong. Egyptian operation proved as competent as European management, demolishing the colonial assumption that infrastructure required Western control. Canal revenue, now flowing entirely to Egypt, funded the Aswan High Dam construction, which began in 1960 with Soviet financing and technical assistance. The dam was completed in 1970, creating Lake Nasser, regulating the Nile's flow, generating massive electricity, and expanding Egyptian agricultural land by 30%. Everything the West had refused to support, the Soviets helped Egypt achieve. The irony was stark. By refusing to fund the dam and then trying to retake the canal militarily, Britain and France had driven Egypt into Soviet partnership and demonstrated the futility of colonial restoration. For the Suez Canal Company's shareholders, the nationalization meant financial loss but not catastrophe. Egypt agreed to compensate shareholders at market value, paid over several years. Most shareholders, particularly British and French institutions, received fair value eventually. The canal itself became one of Egypt's primary revenue sources. By the 1960s, annual transit fees exceeded $100 million. By 2000, over $1 billion. Today, as mentioned at the beginning, the canal generates nearly $10 billion annually. All of that revenue goes to Egypt, the country that built it, that lost control of it for 87 years. and that finally reclaimed it in 1956. But the Suez Crisis had one more consequence that haunts the region today. It intensified Arab-Israeli conflict. Israeli participation in the 1956 invasion, coordinated secretly with Britain and France, confirmed for many Arabs that Israel was a tool of Western imperialism. The perception wasn't entirely accurate. Israel had its own strategic motivations, but the secret coordination revealed by later historical research validated the suspicion. Arab nationalism, energized by Nasser's Suez victory, increasingly defined itself in opposition to both Western imperialism and Israel. The two became fused in political rhetoric, even when actual interests diverged. This fusion contributed to the 1967 Six-Day War, where Nasser's brinkmanship and Israeli preemptive strikes resulted in catastrophic Arab defeat and Israeli occupation of Sinai, Gaza, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. The Suez Canal itself was closed from 1967 to 1975 due to Israeli occupation of the Eastern Bank. When it reopened after the 1973 war and subsequent Camp David Accords, the regional dynamics had shifted dramatically. Egypt, under Anwar Sadat, pursued peace with Israel and alignment with the United States. The canal became less important strategically, as Middle Eastern oil could be shipped via tankers too large for canal transit anyway, and containerization of global shipping reduced the percentage of world trade dependent on Suez. But the canal remained symbolically powerful. Egyptian control of it represented sovereignty reclaimed. Western loss of it represented imperial decline. And the entire saga, from construction to nationalization to crisis, demonstrated how infrastructure becomes inseparable from power politics. When historians analyze the Suez Crisis today, several interpretations compete. Some see it as the definitive end of European colonialism, the moment when Britain and France learned they could no longer impose will on former colonies without American permission and international acceptance. Others emphasize the crisis as a Cold War turning point, where American opposition to Allied imperialism opened space for Soviet influence in the developing world, with consequences that persisted through the 1980s. Still others focus on Egyptian nationalism, viewing Suez as proof that determined smaller nations could resist superpower pressure through strategic positioning and international law. All three interpretations have merit. The crisis was genuinely multiplex, affecting different actors in different ways. What's undeniable is the canal's centrality to the entire story. A waterway built with Egyptian labor and Egyptian money became the instrument of Egyptian subjugation and eventually the symbol of Egyptian independence. Every ship that transits Suez today passes through a channel where workers died by the tens of thousands to build it, where British troops occupied for 74 years to control it, and where Nasser's nationalization sparked a war that nearly went nuclear. The concrete and water are engineering. The meaning is political. And that meaning continues evolving. In 2021, the container ship Ever Given ran aground in the canal, blocking traffic for 6 days. Global shipping faced immediate disruption. Egypt lost roughly $60 million in daily transit fees. The incident demonstrated the canal's continued strategic importance and Egypt's vulnerability to single point of failure risk. Egypt responded by expanding the canal, adding parallel channels to reduce future blockage risk. The expansion cost $8 billion, financed entirely by Egypt without foreign loans. That financial independence itself signals how dramatically Egypt's position has changed. In 1875, Egypt sold canal shares for £4 million to avoid bankruptcy. In 2015, Egypt spent $8 billion expanding the same canal using domestic financing. The canal that symbolized Egypt's subjugation now represents its economic resilience. But history's weight remains. Egyptian schoolchildren learn about the canal's construction as a period of exploitation. They study the British occupation as national humiliation. And they celebrate July 26, 1956, Nationalization Day, as a holiday commemorating sovereignty reclaimed. The canal is infrastructure, but it's also memory, politics, and identity. And understanding why Egypt lost everything and how Britain took it requires grasping that these dimensions are inseparable. The Suez Canal today carries 12% of global trade. Nearly 25,000 ships transit annually, The average passage takes between 13 and 15 hours. Egypt collects tolls based on ship size and cargo type, generating revenue that makes the canal the country's third largest source of foreign currency after tourism and remittances. The canal has been expanded twice since nationalization. In 2015, Egypt completed a 35-kilometer parallel channel, allowing two-way traffic on portions of the route that were previously single-lane. The expansion reduced average transit time and increased capacity by 28 ships daily. Ships today carry goods that didn't exist when the canal opened in 1869. Containerized cargo, liquefied natural gas, crude oil from the Persian Gulf heading to Europe. The global economy's logistics depend on the canal functioning reliably. When the Ever Given blocked the canal in March 2021, the impact was immediate and global. 369 ships queued, waiting for the channel to clear. Every day of blockage delayed $60 million in transit fees for Egypt and disrupted supply chains worldwide. Automotive plants in Europe faced parts shortages. Retailers anticipated inventory delays. Oil prices fluctuated on shipping uncertainty. The incident demonstrated both the canal's critical importance and its fragility. A single ship malfunction could paralyze a choke point handling 12% of world trade. Egypt's response was instructive. Rather than accepting the risk as inevitable, the government accelerated plans for widening and deepening the entire canal. The expansion is ongoing, with completion expected by 2027. Cost estimates exceed $12 billion. The fact that Egypt can finance this independently, without European loans or American assistance, represents a dramatic reversal from the 1870s debt crisis that precipitated British takeover. Modern Egypt still faces enormous economic challenges. Inflation exceeds 15%. The currency has weakened significantly against the dollar. Foreign debt totals $130 billion. Youth unemployment hovers around 30%. But the canal remains profitable and Egyptian-controlled. Revenue projections for the next decade exceed $100 billion total. That revenue flows to the Egyptian government, funding infrastructure, subsidies, and debt service without foreign interference. This matters enormously for Egyptian national identity. Every president since Nasser has emphasized canal sovereignty as proof of Egyptian independence. Anwar Sadat, Hosni Mubarak, and Abdel Fattah el-Sisi have all visited the canal zone regularly, giving speeches that explicitly connect the canal to anti-colonial resistance and national dignity. The rhetoric isn't empty symbolism. For Egyptians who lived through British occupation or learned its history, the canal represents tangible proof that foreign domination ended. But the canal's history also raises uncomfortable questions about Egypt's development path. Would Egypt be wealthier today if it had never built the canal? The debt incurred financing construction bankrupted the country and enabled British takeover. 87 years of colonial rule stunted Egyptian political development, blocked industrialization, and extracted wealth systematically. Meanwhile, the canal itself generated enormous wealth, but almost entirely for European shareholders and British strategic interests until 1956. An alternative history where Egypt avoided the canal project entirely might have resulted in slower modernization but preserved sovereignty. Whether that trade-off would have been preferable is impossible to calculate. What's clearer is the legacy of colonial economic structures. Egypt's economy today remains heavily dependent on primary commodity exports and services like the canal, rather than manufacturing or technology. This dependency traces directly to British colonial policy that deliberately blocked Egyptian industrialization. Cotton production, which fueled Egypt's initial debt crisis in the 1860s, remains significant to Egypt's economy. The country is the world's sixth largest cotton producer. But Egypt exports raw cotton and imports finished textiles, exactly the colonial pattern Cromer enforced in the 1890s. Breaking this pattern has proven difficult. Successive Egyptian governments have attempted industrialization with limited success. Manufacturing exists, but remains smaller than services and agriculture as a percentage of GDP. The Suez Canal zone itself reflects these dynamics. The zone has been designated as special economic area, with tax incentives for manufacturing and logistics companies. The goal is to leverage the canal's geographic position to attract investment. Results have been mixed. Some logistics companies have established regional hubs, but large-scale manufacturing hasn't materialized at the scale Egyptian planners hoped. This connects to a broader question about infrastructure and development. The canal was supposed to make Egypt wealthy by positioning the country at the crossroads of global trade. Instead, it made European powers wealthy, while Egypt provided land and labor. Even after nationalization, the canal's benefits are limited. Transit fees are substantial, but they don't transform Egypt's economy. The revenue funds government operations and debt service, but hasn't catalyzed the kind of broad-based industrial development that countries like South Korea or Taiwan achieved. Why not? Partly because canal revenue is passive income collected from ships passing through, not wealth generated by productive economic activity. It's economically similar to oil revenue for petrostates, significant but not necessarily developmental. This realization has led some Egyptian economists to argue the country should prioritize manufacturing, technology, and education investment over canal expansion. The counterargument is that canal revenue funds precisely those investments, making expansion rational. Both perspectives have merit. The debate itself illustrates how the canal remains central to Egyptian economic planning despite nationalization occurring 70 years ago. Internationally, the canal's legacy shapes how former colonial powers relate to Egypt. Britain maintains diplomatic relations with Egypt, but the historical baggage is enormous. British officials visiting Egypt routinely face questions about colonial occupation, the canal seizure, and debt manipulation. British museums hold Egyptian artifacts taken during the occupation. Repatriation requests are ongoing and contentious. France's relationship is complicated differently. French technical assistance helped build the canal, and French shareholders profited for decades. But France also participated in the 1956 invasion attempt. Contemporary French-Egyptian relations emphasize economic partnership while carefully avoiding colonial history. For the United States, which opposed European colonialism during the Suez Crisis, the legacy is more positive. American support for Egyptian sovereignty in 1956 is remembered favorably. This contributed to Egypt's eventual alignment with the United States after Nasser's death, a relationship that persists despite periodic tensions. The canal also shaped international law regarding nationalization and sovereignty. Nasser's 1956 nationalization established precedent that sovereign nations could seize private company assets operating on their territory, provided fair compensation. This precedent was cited by other developing nations, nationalizing oil companies, mines and infrastructure in the 1960s and 1970s. International law evolved to recognize resource sovereignty as a legitimate state right, partly based on the Suez case. But the 1956 crisis also demonstrated that legal right doesn't guarantee immunity from military retaliation. Britain and France invaded despite Egypt's legal position being defensible. Only American pressure prevented successful recolonization. This taught developing nations that international law works only when great powers choose to enforce it. Small nations need either powerful allies or nuclear weapons to guarantee sovereignty against intervention. Egypt chose the alliance path, first with the Soviet Union, later with the United States. The choice was pragmatic, not ideological. Looking forward, the canal faces new challenges. Climate change is raising sea levels, which could affect canal operations and coastal infrastructure at Port Said and Suez. Egypt is investing in protective barriers and reinforced embankments. Container ship sizes continue increasing. The largest vessels today are 400 meters long and 60 meters wide, near the limits of the expanded canal's capacity. If shipping continues toward even larger vessels, the canal may require further expansion or face irrelevance for the biggest ships. Alternative routes are also developing. Russia's melting Arctic ice is opening northern shipping routes that could bypass Suez entirely for Europe-Asia trade. The routes aren't yet reliable year-round, but climate change may make them viable within decades. And China's Belt and Road Initiative includes rail corridors across Central Asia that could move goods faster than ships, potentially reducing maritime trade through Suez. Egypt is monitoring these developments carefully. Canal revenue is too important to risk losing to alternative routes. Expansion plans partly aim to ensure the canal remains competitive on speed and cost. The historical irony is rich. Egypt built the canal to modernize and profit from global trade. Instead, Egypt lost sovereignty and wealth for nearly a century. Now, 70 years after reclaiming the canal, Egypt must continually invest to prevent the canal from becoming strategically obsolete. The lesson from this entire saga is that infrastructure alone doesn't determine outcomes. Power, politics, and financial structures matter more than engineering. Egypt built a world-changing waterway. Europeans controlled it, profited from it, and used it to dominate Egypt. Egypt eventually reclaimed it through nationalism, international pressure, and American Cold War priorities. Today, Egypt controls the canal, but still navigates global economic structures shaped partly by the colonial legacy the canal represents. The concrete endures. The politics continue evolving, and the canal remains what it's always been: engineering inseparable from empire. So we've seen how a vision of progress became a century of exploitation. How Ferdinand de Lesseps convinced Egypt to build a canal that would bankrupt the nation. How tens of thousands of Egyptian workers died digging through desert sand with forced labor disguised as modernization. How Egypt paid compensation for ending slavery. How Britain purchased strategic control with one check and converted financial leverage into military occupation. We've watched Lord Cromer rule Egypt for 24 years, extracting wealth systematically while blocking Egyptian development. We've seen Egyptian nationalism emerge from that oppression, culminating in Nasser's nationalization and the crisis that ended British imperial power. And we've traced the canal from symbol of subjugation to symbol of sovereignty reclaimed. The story resists simple moral categorization. De Lesseps genuinely believed the canal would benefit Egypt and humanity through enhanced global connectivity. He wasn't entirely wrong. The canal did transform global trade. British officials genuinely believed Egyptian governance was incompetent, and that European administration improved Egyptian welfare. Some infrastructure projects under Cromer were beneficial, but intentions don't justify outcomes. Egypt built the canal and lost everything: sovereignty, wealth, political autonomy, and human lives by the tens of thousands. European powers profited enormously, while Egyptian development stagnated. The real lesson here isn't that all infrastructure projects are colonial traps, or that international cooperation is impossible. The lesson is that power structures determine who benefits from shared projects. Egypt lacked the financial sophistication to negotiate favorable terms with de Lesseps. Egypt lacked the political strength to resist European debt manipulation. And Egypt lacked the military capacity to prevent occupation once bankruptcy made intervention feasible. Those structural weaknesses, financial, political, military, determined outcomes more than the canal's engineering or even the intentions of individuals involved. When you step back and look at the full picture, the Suez Canal's history illustrates how colonialism functioned beyond military conquest. Debt became leverage. Infrastructure became justification for intervention. Bankruptcy became opportunity for takeover. Britain didn't invade Egypt in 1882 because British leaders were uniquely villainous. They invaded because Egypt's debt crisis threatened British strategic interests, and because Britain had the military power to intervene without significant cost. The system worked exactly as designed: transfer risk and cost to weaker parties, extract benefits to stronger parties, use legal and financial mechanisms to make exploitation appear legitimate. This pattern repeated throughout the colonial period. Infrastructure projects in India, railways in Africa, mines in Latin America, all followed similar trajectories. Local governments borrowed European capital, built projects, accumulated debt they couldn't service, and lost control to European creditors backed by European militaries. The Suez Canal is perhaps the most dramatic example because of the canal's strategic importance and Egypt's proximity to Europe. But it's not unique. What makes Egypt's story particularly significant is the nationalization's success. Unlike many post-colonial nations that struggled after independence, Egypt successfully operated the canal after 1956, proving European claims of technical necessity were false. Egyptian engineers, pilots, and administrators ran the canal as efficiently as the French company had. Revenue increased under Egyptian management. Safety records remained strong. The colonial assertion that Egyptians couldn't manage complex infrastructure was revealed as racist fiction. That success matters enormously for understanding decolonization broadly. European powers justified colonialism partly by claiming colonized peoples lacked capacity for self-governance and technical management. The Suez Canal's operation under Egyptian control demolished that justification for future independence movements. Today, 70 years after nationalization, the canal is expanding again under complete Egyptian control. The country that lost everything in the 1870s now finances billion-dollar infrastructure projects independently. Whether we like it or not, the canal's history shaped the modern Middle East profoundly. The debt crisis enabled British occupation. British occupation suppressed Egyptian nationalism, which then exploded into the Arab nationalism Nasser led. Arab nationalism challenged Western influence throughout the region. The resulting conflicts, Arab-Israeli wars, oil embargoes, regional instability, trace partly back to resentments rooted in the colonial period the canal epitomized. None of this means contemporary Middle Eastern politics are solely explained by colonialism. But colonialism's legacy provides essential context for understanding ongoing regional dynamics. The Suez Canal remains what it has always been, a channel of water with enormous political meaning. Ships pass through daily carrying goods between continents. The engineering is mundane now, normalized by over 150 years of operation. But for Egypt, the canal is memory made physical. Every Egyptian schoolchild learns about the forced labor that built it, the British occupation that controlled it, and Nasser's nationalization that reclaimed it. The canal is threaded through Egyptian national identity as proof that resistance to foreign domination is possible. For Britain and France, the canal represents imperial ambitions that failed. The Suez Crisis was the moment both nations confronted their diminished global status. The failure to retake the canal militarily demonstrated that the age of European empires had definitively ended. For students of history, the canal illustrates how infrastructure becomes inseparable from power. Engineering and politics aren't separate domains. Building a waterway created financial relationships that enabled colonialism. Controlling that waterway shaped global strategy for a century. So the question remains, was building the Suez Canal worth the cost for Egypt? The human cost was staggering: deaths, forced labor, financial ruin, lost sovereignty. But the long-term outcome is $10 billion annually in revenue, controlled by Egyptians, infrastructure that positions Egypt strategically, and a symbol of independence that defines national identity. Perhaps the real question isn't whether it was worth it, but whether Egypt ever had a choice. Once European powers decided the canal should be built, Egypt's options were limited to degrees of exploitation, not whether to participate at all. That might be the darkest lesson from the entire story. If you made it this far through 17,000 words about a waterway in the desert, leave A in the comments. Seriously, this was a massive script, and if you stuck with it, you're the exact audience I create these documentaries for. The Suez Canal story connects to so many other historical events we could explore. The British Empire's infrastructure projects in India followed similar patterns: massive undertaking, colonial exploitation, infrastructure that outlasted the empire. Or we could look at the Panama Canal, which has its own complicated history of American intervention, disease, and financial manipulation. If you want to see either of those stories told with the same depth and detail, let me know in the comments. I read every comment, and your suggestions genuinely shape what I research next. Hit subscribe if you haven't already. These long-form documentaries take weeks of research and scripting, and subscriber support makes it possible to keep creating them instead of switching to shorter, easier content. And if you want more deep dives into how infrastructure shaped imperialism, I have an entire video about the Berlin-Baghdad Railway, another massive engineering project that became a geopolitical nightmare. It's linked in the description, and it shares a lot of thematic DNA with this Suez story. Thank you for watching. Thank you for engaging with complicated history that doesn't reduce to simple heroes and villains. And thank you for spending nearly an hour learning about a century of Egyptian history that textbooks usually compress into a single paragraph. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, think critically about who builds infrastructure and who benefits from it. The answer reveals more about power than any political speech ever could.